Right, so here we go. We're going to talk about woods, only though in the context of 1.2 performance characteristics. If you want to see more details about like woods in terms of the other topics in technical principles, then see my other slides deck and you'll find all the details in terms of manufacturing process and everything. Okay, let's get into it. So the first thing is just having an overview of the primary source of timbers. Now, generally, we can make a lot of sort of assumptions about where timbers come from. It's commonly associated that softwoods come from more what we call temperate zones in the world. So temperate zones meaning colder climates or climates where there are like, say, 4 seasons throughout the year. Now we can see that here you get a lot of softwoods up in Canada and the USA and in Europe. So you can see this green band going on the map up here. That's kind of where you'd see a lot of like fir trees. So we're talking things like pine and redwood and spruce and larch. Those are typical softwood trees you get in those climates because it's very far north and yeah, it's cooler up there. If we go to the first slide, you can see on here we've got the main identifier between hardwoods and softwoods. Softwoods are coniferous trees, so think Christmas trees. So they've got needles, and these needles, they don't shed in cold weather, whereas these do. Softwood trees, most of them lose their leaves in winter. So that's another distinguishing factor. So other ones, hardwoods are much more universal in terms of the location where they come from. So hardwoods come from all over the place. You get a sort of exotic hardwoods, which are ones that come from the tropics. So we're talking about ones like rosewood and mahogany and balsa wood. Those almost come from like the jungles. Some of them, particularly like rosewood, is very synonymous with more traditional Asian furniture and cabinet making. It's a very, very dark color. Whereas woods like maple are very commonly associated with sort of, well, I suppose it's stereotypical to say Canada, like North America. I mean, the maple leaf is Canada's national symbol, but there's a lot of maple trees grow there. So obviously, it's a very abundant material in that location. So yeah, it's just good to have an idea of where these trees come from and where the types of wood come from. So the next thing then is talking about conversion. Now, conversion is essentially the translation of a log that's cut from a tree, or a tree being cut down to then being cut into logs to then being transformed into usable timber. So conversion, there's different ways of converting a log, and there's basically different cut profiles, and they all yield different types of stock forms. So you can see here there's various methods of getting different shapes and different sizes of planks out of a log, and they've got different names like bolt cut, through and through, tangential, quarter, whatever. So yeah, so you can just do a little bit of searching around just to sort of see the specifics, and these videos here are really good at showing like the fundamentals of how logs are converted. Now, when logs have been converted, they've been cut. Unfortunately, timber can't just be used straight away as it is. It has to go through then a process called seasoning. Now, seasoning, it's without this, timber is essentially unusable. I mean, timber, when it comes straight from the tree, we actually almost call it like green timber because it's still wet. It's still got a lot of sap, and it's got a lot of lignin, which is the timber's natural sort of resiny, adhesive-y sort of liquid that's in the wood. And some of them are very, very wet. And if you try to use the timber in that state for construction, the timber is actually very weak and very, very elastic, very, very bendy. So you can't use timbers in that form. So we have to season them. Now, seasoning is basically a process of extracting the moisture, and it's almost stabilizing the timber. Now, it actually has all sorts of different benefits to the wood. So, I mean, it basically gives the timber a lot greater resistance against decay and rot, and also a lot more resistance to, say, insect attack or insect infestation, like wood lice, for example. And equally, if you're adding preservatives to a timber as part of the seasoning process, it helps the preservatives to penetrate deeper as well. And it means that the woods are more stable if, say, they're attached to metals, particularly in construction. If you attach them to like a ferrous metal, Often metals can be toxic to woods. Say copper, for example, is a copper oxide is actually very toxic to woods and can end up killing a tree. But it can also degrade the timber as well. So seasoning has all sorts of benefits. There's different ways of doing it. So air seasoning is the cheapest and most commonly used way. So this is where planks are left out in the open for, I mean, anything up to a year really, outside in the natural environment. So and this is often done near where the trees are harvested. Yeah, sometimes if you're walking the countryside in certain countries, you'll suddenly walk past a massive air seasoning stack, and all it is just a frame with a roof over the top to keep the rain off them. But they don't sort of try and very quickly extract the moisture from the timber. They just let it air dry. And the advantage of this is it sort of has a natural level of moisture for that environment. So it doesn't completely dry the wood out. It still retains a little bit of moisture for the humidity of that environment. So if this timber is then going to be used for outdoor applications in this country, that's a very appropriate way of seasoning it. So air seasoning, great for anything that's going to be used outdoors, which will still be subjected to moisture changes in moisture level. So things like outdoor furniture or construction, or even things like wooden window frames or something like that. It's a very cost-effective way of doing it. The disadvantage is that it takes quite a long time, anything up to a year to do, but it is cheaper, a lot cheaper. So the more expensive and much faster way of seasoning is just doing kiln seasoning, and this is just a matter of days. So this is basically they have a massive heat box with the door on the front. So they put all the planks in there, then they shut the door, and then it's literally like a sauna, and it just is very hot and very dry, and it just sucks out all the moisture. And they've got fans in the top just to circulate the air. And yeah, that will literally that can extract up almost up to, I don't know, within sort of the high 90s% of moisture in the timber. So yeah, it's a very efficient process. And this is great for if you're wanting to make indoor furniture products, like especially out of really high quality hardwoods or something, because if they're going to be used indoor, the chances are the indoors is a much drier environment than outdoors. So it's much more appropriate for a timber to be kiln dried and then used for an indoor application. But obviously it's a lot more expensive. So if you were wanting to make a beautiful sort of handcrafted, lovely hardwood chair, say from mahogany or oak, getting some that is specified as having been kiln dried. So, for example, timbers when they're bought in stock forms, they'll have the letters afterwards AD or KD, and that's the signifier for how it's been seasoned. So, AD being air dried and KD being kiln dried. So, yeah. So if you're doing an indoor product, high quality, you want to look for one that says KD afterwards. Okay, moving on. You need to know the names of specific softwoods, hardwoods, and manufactured boards. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what these are now. So as you can see here, we've got different softwood trees, and I said they basically pretty much all of them look like Christmas trees. Key signifying features of softwoods are they are very knotty. Generally, when I say knotty, um, a knot is where a branch has grown out of the main trunk of the tree, and so it changes the grain, and it basically causes an imperfection in the grain. So you can see here these little knots here is where a branch would have grown out, and there's lots and lots of branches on softwood trees, and very thin as well. Now sometimes these knots can be seen as being quite a sort of an aesthetic factor of the timber, but equally they can be an absolute nuisance because they're really hard and they can end up breaking saw blades, or even drill bits can run into trouble if you're drilling into a piece of timber and it hits a knot and it can end up breaking it and stuff. So you have to be very careful when you're working with softwoods. But yeah, they are softer. Clearly, they are easy. They're pretty easy to work with. They are much less dense than hardwoods. So because of that, if you've got a length of two timbers, one's softwood, one's hardwood, with a tenon saw, it's a lot easier to cut through the softwood. So like pine, you can, because it's a lot less dense. There's less material to cut through. So um, yeah, so it's actually quicker to work with. So softwoods are typically used for things like house frames, for example. So if you're building a house and it's got a wooden frame structure, pine or of some degree, like whether Scots pine or just regular pine, is a common choice for that. Woods like cedar, and this one on the right is cedar. It's a beautiful color. It's sort of got this lovely reddish brown color and mixed with sort of creamy color tones. This is stunning when it's polished up and smoothed over, and just looks amazing. So this is used for all sorts of things like construction, but also furniture items are made from cedar as well. Um, yeah, so other applications, things like larch, are used for outdoor applications. So they might be used for fencing. Because it's very durable. It lasts a long time in an outdoor environment. So fence posts and things might be made from larch, for example. So what you need to do is just have a look at the applications that are typical to these specific softwoods here. Okay, so that's the overview of softwoods. Hardwoods, on the other hand, are much more broad ranging in terms of their properties and their uses. So generally, not always, but generally hardwoods are denser. Now remember that one of the little sort of flies in the ointment, as it were, there are balsa wood. Balsa wood is very, very low density, and because of that, it's incredibly light and it's very buoyant. So it's very good for using in things like boats or aeroplanes or whatever. So, yeah, it's a very interesting example, actually, balsa. Of an unusual hardwood. Now, yes, we've got some types of hardwoods here. So we've got the sort of very exotic mahogany tree on the right. You see very, very dark. We've got the oak tree, which is very synonymous with being this very gnarled, sort of crooked, skewed, twisted trunk. And this one is, I think, a beech or a birch tree. So you can see there's no knots in these. The branches are much, much thicker, and so when they convert the logs into timber, they can basically avoid having any knots in the wood. So it's much, much easier to work with in terms of having perfect, products in terms of there's no knots or imperfections in the wood that's being used. Um, Hardwoods are really nice for finishing. So if you're making a lovely table and you want to sand it down, because they're so dense, when you sand it down, if you use a very, very fine grade of sandpaper like P1200, you can achieve almost a mirror-like finish on the timber, particularly like the really dense ones like ash and maple. You can actually polish them down without any wax, varnish, nothing. And if you go even finer and actually use like wire wool or something, you can literally hold it up to the light and you'll see the light shimmering off it. So it's really hard to get that. You can't really get that with softwoods because they're not dense enough. So that's why they're so great. Softwoods, on the other hand, are a lot cheaper. They take way less time to grow. I mean, we're talking up to 50 years to mature for a softwood compared to hardwoods, which can take hundreds of years to grow. I mean, oak trees like this will be hundreds of years old. So it's a lot easier to be sustainable with softwoods because they're quicker to grow. The forests can be managed more easily. So it kind of works like this. You've got a forest section of softwood trees there. They'll harvest from say the front of the forest, and then as the forest moves they'll replant at the back. So yeah, they'll sort of where they cut down they'll then replant. Or they might replant 3 trees for every one that they cut down. So it's a lot easier to harvest and manage softwood forests. So yeah, they're a lot more sustainable. Hardwoods are less sustainable, and there's some that the trees take so long to grow that the timber is basically not available, or it's just ridiculously expensive. So yeah. Okay, manufactured boards, or sometimes called man-made boards. These are very, very good for cheap applications and things where you need mass production of the same item. So this is why we immediately need to think of things like IKEA furniture, because you can get a massive sheet of plywood or MDF and put it on a CNC router, and your CAD data will be fed into that, and it will cut out, say, I don't know, a load of wardrobes. And because you buy the manufactured boards in set sizes, you know exactly how many of a certain type of product you can get onto one panel that you buy. You need to look into the different applications of the different types of manufactured boards. I mean, plywood, there's many different grades of plywood. The basic plywood is used for sort of structural things, but you also get things like furniture grade plywood, which is basically regular plywood, but it's got higher quality wood used in it. So you can actually get like birch faced plywood, and it's got a layer of birch on the outside faces, so it looks way nicer. Marine plywood is obviously used for marine applications typically. Flexible plywood is incredibly bendy. It's very, very low density, so it can be bent around and then set in a certain shape. So you need to have a look at what these different types of manufactured boards are used for. Okay, then we've got veneers. Now there's really two types of veneers. You get actual timber-based veneers. So these are ones where if you're wanting to be a bit budget with the work that you're doing, you might make a bit of furniture out of MDF, but then on the outside you then glue a layer of veneer on the outside of the MDF, and you cover every surface of the MDF in the veneer. And because the veneer is literally paper thin, it's actually quite flexible. So you can kind of, it's almost like wrapping the MDF in veneer. So then it kind of makes it look as though it's been made from a hardwood, even though it hasn't. So it's kind of like a trick of the eye. And it's a great way of keeping costs right down with manufacturing. So that's why sometimes in IKEA, it looks like you're buying a hardwood piece of furniture, but actually you're not. You're buying MDF and it's been wrapped in hardwood veneer. So it's a great way of keeping costs down, and it's more sustainable, arguably. So that's timber-based veneers. You can get veneer for pretty much any timber because it's just a log that's been rotated on a lathe, and they just cut it out like paper. The other one is a more structural, not structural. It's a more of a sort of mechanical application. So MF, so that's melamine formaldehyde, which is a thermosetting plastic, so it's heat proof. Now, what they do with these can come in a range of colors, and they can put a layer of MF laminates on the outside of a type of manufactured board. The advantage of this being that you then get a heat-proof surface, and it's really durable. It's very, very tough. So this is great for things like kitchen worktops or cupboards in schools, or tabletops in schools or something like that, because the MF is very tough, it's very hard, it's heat resistant, it's easy to clean. It just doesn't get damaged like woods do. So overall, it's a much, much better material to use. There's a really good video on here which shows the step-by-step process of producing plywood. So please watch that so you can note down the steps that the wood goes through. In terms of stock forms, types, and sizes, this is something that's good to know. So you get what's called rough sawn first. So you can hear this is just like probably air-dried, air-seasoned planks, and they're called rough sawn. And that's basically where the log has literally just been stripped down into sections like this. Like they sometimes call it 2x4 or something, or wherever you're from. And yeah, there's no like there's the faces are not necessarily square to each other. They're sometimes they might be slightly out. So they need to then be planed down if you're going to use them for something that needs to be a bit more accurate. Now, plain square edge is where you have two faces of the length of timber that are actually 90 degrees to each other, perpendicular. So two faces of the timber have been planed. The other sides might not have been planed. So this is great if you're using it for, I don't know, part of a structure where you will see part of the timber. It will be visible, so you want to have a nice finish, but you don't want to go through the cost of having all of the edges, all the faces planed down. So you can just have one where it's just like part of it's planed down. Then you get planed all round, or PAR, and this is where this is kind of more for furniture grade timber, where every surface of the timber has been planed down, so they're all perfectly 90 degrees to each other, and it's got a lovely finish on it already. Yeah, and then the last one is called moldings, and these are more decorative features. So this is where you have a length of timber that's basically been routed in to have a certain profile, and then these can be cut to shape. So you can see typical applications of this are like what we call wood paneling. You sometimes have on sort of more luxury style interiors. So you have these sort of ceiling moldings that have been cut and then glued in place, and then it sort of has that sort of very, very ornate decorative style. Even dowel, which is like these sort of rods of wood, those are technically called, or the categorized as being a molding. So yeah, that's it, guys. Thanks for sticking with this. I hope that was helpful, and get in touch if you have any more questions.